I sometimes have to remind myself to treat myself as I would treat someone I cared so deeply about. Reflecting on my career in my life, I think that so much of it converges, especially when you love what you're doing. I'm trying to reflect on a time where I might have had a struggle or a trouble, and then sort of how I navigated and negotiated to get to a better place. And I think, it's more of what I'm going to share is a thread versus an instance. What I found in my career is I would become, at times, I felt like I kept revisiting the same kind of archetype and situation in my career with a dynamic between someone else. And without, of course, naming names or pointing fingers, it was a certain personality that was typically a very loud voice, a very strong voice, and a very commanding voice in a room. And I would find myself um, neglecting to find my voice, or neglecting to speak my truth, or neglecting um, to stand up for either what I knew was the right thing, or to defend a position that I felt was in the best interest of either people or the company or the purpose. So this trouble or struggle, I'd say, has been the continuous cycle of revisiting and finding myself in the same situation or same boardroom or conference room or call or meeting with this archetype. And I would say it hasn't been easy. And I think this goes back to perhaps the way that I was raised, and it was rise above it, or it was kind of bite the bullet kid, or it was even just peace at any price. Those were some of those are some of the sayings that I grew up with. And so I felt myself swallowing a lot of that for a long time. And just figuring out how to navigate my way through it, but feeling really distraught in the inside. So what I've learned is, number one, self-reflection, and I think this is a process, which is learning to know that some of those feelings I might have felt in those moments, which were frustrated, that's natural. And I probably had every right to feel frustrated or upset or emotional in certain situations. So during the self-reflection, I think it's um, understanding the patterns I kept getting myself into, understanding the archetypes of those kind of people that I was finding myself at odds with, but beginning to love and respect and understand that I, in my own right, did and could and should have a voice at the table. So for me, it was after doing this self-reflection, identifying this, which, by the way, of course, helps when you have great therapy and people around you. But beginning to define my own boundaries. And I'd say my boundaries for me are like, what are my negotiables and non-negotiables when it comes to the working arrangements and environments that I'm in? How do I want to be treated, and how do I treat other people? And making sure that was a boundary around humanity and empathy and heart. And those were all negotiables and non-negotiables. And I actually have a list. So then the third thing, which is how do I navigate through these troubles, is once I kind of understand and do the self-reflecting, and once you start to define your own boundaries of what are your own principles and values, and where do you create these non-negotiables, in your life or in your career, it becomes around using that as a framework. So it's not so troublesome and overwhelming when you encounter that archetype again and you come back in that full circle. So for me, having a framework sounds so orderly and type A, but was so important for me to say, like, wait a minute, I'm noticing this pattern again. And one of my non-negotiables is not to accept being treated less than, or being shushed, or certain disparaging comments that could be made, whether it was to myself or someone else. And if I couldn't change that person, I could certainly change where I was, the environment I was, the choices I was making about being there. And that would be how I've navigated through trouble, struggle, and the lessons that I've learned along the way, which have not been easy. but to get to the point where it's not quite so hard as it once was.